All right. Good afternoon. I'm Samantha from the law offices of Samantha Wolfe, and I'm happy that everybody could jump on our virtual seminar. We always like to do these once a month, so we've been having fun coming up with some neat topic ideas. So thanks for joining us today. Our office is located at 20 East 6th Street in Suite 206 in Waynesboro, and you can reach us at 717-655-2676. For those of you who aren't familiar with our office, we always offer consultations and we are able to do them virtually. We do them by the phone or we are able to do them in person as well. So if anybody wants, after they listen to this, wants some additional information, you're always welcome to call our office and we can schedule with you. Let's get started. All right, so this is our mission statement. Did take us a while for everybody here at the staff to kind of craft this and be excited about it. So we always like to share it when we're starting our sessions there. So today we get to fall back to the basics of business. So we know that fall is starting now. Summer has wound down, and so we're excited for the fall season. We know that that means everybody's back to school. For us, that means that we're taking a look at all of our clients and any businesses that they may have created. And so today what I want to do is I want to focus on two things. So the first thing I want to focus on is starting a business. So for those of you who are interested in what goes into starting a business, we want to cover that today. We also want to cover if you have a business and you might need to make some changes or update things. We want to make sure that we can give you some tips on how to make sure that you're operating your business according to what Pennsylvania law requires. So we're going to approach our seminar in two ways. So the first way we're going to do it is we are going to talk about how to start a business. So business succession planning is something that I feel really passionate about. And I think it starts here in our community with a lot of our farmers. We have a lot of farming families here in the surrounding area, Waynesboro and everywhere around us. And so I think it's important to remember that to me, farming is also a business. And some people look at it a little bit differently, but here in our office, we treat it very similar to any other business that a client may have. So it started off helping farmers, and our practice has just expanded into helping other businesses in the area. So steps when starting a business plan. So we want to kind of give you a roadmap of what legally you want to make sure that you're doing when you start a business. And then we're actually going to take it step by step through each one. So the first thing is that to the extent you're able to, we always recommend a written business plan. Here at our office, we're happy to do that for you. So we always do a written plan, whether somebody's doing estate planning or long-term care planning or doing a business succession plan. We always like to write it down, talk about what we're doing, why we're doing it. A lot of times we may even initially start off with a plan that has multiple recommendations about how to either start your business, how to better your business, or how to transition your business. So our office is happy to jot down the legal aspect of it. But even things I know when I started my business, writing what I planned to do, a list of what I needed to get done before I actually opened the doors. It could be something really informal like that. And then it could be something, where you have charts and graphs and all that good stuff. The second thing you want to do is create the business using a business name. And we're going to focus on this in the next couple of slides, but you have to be careful about what you pick. And so we want to make sure that you're creating the business name along with picking the correct entity in order to be able to navigate all the taxes the way you want to be able to do that. You want to file for your employer identification number. So you want to obtain that EIN number. You also want to register your business. And when we're talking about registering your business, that's with the state of Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania requires docketing statements to be filed, requires usually a certificate of organization or articles of incorporation, depending on the business. And we'll go into specifics in some later slides about what exactly the terminology is. And then on those paperwork, you have to have the federal and state tax ID numbers on that when you're submitting it to the state. The reason that's so important is because a lot of times people set up a business for creditor protection and to provide some liability protection. And it has to be registered with the Department of State here in Pennsylvania in order for you to have the maximum amount of creditor protection. The Department of State in Pennsylvania has a website where you can go and search for any business And what it's designed to do is to give you the registered office. And the registered office is where you can send any notifications, any official court things that you might have, as well as, here at our office, if we're just looking for where do we have the address for IRS tax purposes, we want to make sure all of that matches up. You might need to apply for any licenses or permits. So a lot of that depends on the type of business that you're operating. So here at our office, we've helped with certain types of licenses and permits that our clients may needed to have obtained. Here personally, I have to maintain my attorney license, and that comes around once a year, as well as annually, I have to do a registration for the business entity itself. So those are the type of things we're talking about there. And then the last part of it is opening that bank account. And the reason why that's number 6 on our list is because when you open a bank account, typically they're going to ask for things like the governing documents, so the bylaw or operating agreement that you're using, as well as those things that you filed with the Department of State. So you want to make sure you've done all of the things, steps 1 through 5, before you actually open the bank account. So with that being said, this is a nice roadmap of what we're going to cover in today's session. Now we're going to break it down a little bit. So if we go back to the first thing, let's go, Amy, let's go to the business name and how to do that. And it's just taking a second to advance the slide. There we go. Okay, so is the name that you would like to use, is it available? So you can go, this is the website that we use. We go to the Department of State website and they have a search option that you can click on, and you can type in whatever name you're thinking of, and you want to keep it general. So for example, if I have a business that's going to be known as the Blue Room, let's just say I'm sitting here in our conference room, let's just say we want to call our business the Blue Room LLC. And so one of the things that you would do is you would get on the search and see, type in blue, start off there, or Blue Room. You don't want to actually put too much information there because you want to see what everybody else has registered their business as. So we've had a couple of instances where, especially when it's an entity designed to own real estate and people don't necessarily want to use their name, a lot of times we'll have people say, well, I'll use my initials. So, if I were to do that, it would be SKW. And if I typed in SKW and hit enter in the search bar, it may come up with multiple entities that have those initials in the title of the business. And that's important because Pennsylvania is pretty particular about the naming. So we've learned that here in our office that even things like, if it's one word, if there's one different word in there, it can make a difference when you're filing those business paperwork with the state. And so you want to make sure that it's not close to anything else, because Pennsylvania will require you to file consent forms where you have to give somebody who has a similar business name, they have to sign off on you using something that has the same derivative form. So if I wanted to use SKW Properties LLC, but there was always already an SKW Corporation maybe, or it might be SKW Limited, or it could be any form. But if the main part of the name is SKW, the state will bounce that back and say that you have to get consent from the other entities that have similar names. So we've had that a couple of times where people have wanted to use their initials and it's created some issues. So the first thing you want to do is make sure your name is available, whatever you're planning to use. And a lot of times people ask, well, how do I pick what my name is? And so sometimes it depends if you're going to be using it for marketing purposes. There might be a reason that you're picking something specific. If it's not, if it's something for real estate where you want it to be a little more anonymous, then initials are a great way to do it. Maybe the street where the property is located. Those are all ideas of how you can do that. And so you want to start off, this is the first place you go. If you have a search engine, you can just type in Pennsylvania Department of State. It will take you right there. If you don't go to this direct address, across the top, there are some tabs, and there is a business tab. You click on that, and that will be one of the options off to the right, the business search. So that's the first place you start. The next place you're going to go is applying for your EIN. So know that this is actually the second thing you're going to do. And sometimes you're going to do it in conjunction with, after you search the name, you don't actually want to register with the Department of State until you have this employer identification number. Now, here's the thing. Before you enter the name to get your EIN number, you want to make sure the name is actually available in PA. So that's why we have looking up the name in Pennsylvania before you actually get your employer identification number. We had an instance recently where the EIN was obtained and a name was used, and when it was filed then with the state, one name was actually, or one word of the title was actually omitted when it was filed with the Department of State. And when the client came to our office, the issue was is that the banks weren't allowing them to open a bank account because it was missing that one word that they had used in applying for the EIN. So you want to make sure that you're applying appropriately using the correct name, but you do want to have thought through what type of entity you're going to be before you apply for the EIN, because it does ask you that. So you can do that by just getting on their website. They do have a nice IRS EIN tutorial thing that you can just click on. It walks you through the steps. So you're going to apply for that online. If your business is located in the United States or in the U.S. territories, the person who's applying for the EIN must have a taxpayer identification number. And usually they do require that number to be entered when you're actually obtaining the EIN. Here at our office, what we'll do a lot of times is if we have a client coming in, we may actually do it while the client is here, help them, walk through that. The other thing we may do is we may get them to sign an authorization that does allow our office to obtain the EIN number for them on the IRS website. You want to make sure as you're going through, though, you're understanding all the questions. So we're a law office here. We do this pretty regularly. And sometimes we still have questions when, we're filling out these questions, talking about, it might be what type of entity. Is it going to be a sole proprietorship, LLC? Is it going to be a partnership? So you want to make sure you're thinking that through before you actually apply for the EIN. I have had an instance where somebody applied for an EIN and they used one name and it wasn't available in PA. And so they actually had to close the EIN number. And we have a letter that we send to the IRS asking them to close that. And we did that for a client and we did get notification back from the IRS. It did take a couple of months, but they had closed out that account there. So know that you want to make sure that you're thinking these things through before you actually submit the application. But once you've gone through it, and it usually only takes couple of minutes to do. The website, your session will expire after 15 minutes if it hasn't been active. So it's not something where you can go into the IRS website, start the process, and then go and start doing all of these other things thinking you'll have time to go back. You want to make sure when you're sitting down to get your EIN, you're going to go through the entire application process. Then you submit your application. You do want to have the option, typically you have the option to download that IRS letter confirming the EIN number, and you want to make sure you do that. And then typically they do follow up, the IRS does follow up with a letter in the mail confirming your EIN. Okay, so now we get to go to the Pennsylvania Department of State. So remember, we've already searched for our name. We found out the name is available. We applied for the EIN, and now we're going to the state. So what does the state require us to do? So this is a copy of the docketing statement for a new business entity. So there are two ways you can do it with the Department of State. Our office actually has an online account with the Department of State, and we're able to get online, complete the forms, and submit them for clients. What we do is we actually print them out, complete them. We'll have the client sign the forms as if we were going to send it in the mail, but then we just file it online for our clients. But you can print out these forms. So this is a docketing statement that's required for a new entity. So you see on there, it requires the entity name, does ask for the tax responsible party. So you put the individual there, their mailing address, you describe the business activities, you put the EIN. That's why you have to have already obtained the EIN number for the business, because you do have to disclose it here on this docketing statement. And then it does ask, what are you using as the year end for the business? And so this is a docketing statement that you actually submit at the same time that you submit whatever the creation documentation that you use in Pennsylvania. So let's go and take a look at an example of that. So this is a certificate of organization. So a certificate of organization would be for a limited liability company or an LLC. You're going to see the filing fee is $125 to file that. So there's no filing fee for the docketing statement, but there is a filing fee for the organizational filing that you have to do. So in this case, if we're creating an LLC, it would be the certificate of organization. So there's a filing fee there. They ask, of course, the name. They ask for the registered office. They're going to ask for who is organizing or creating the business, and then they're going to ask, when do you want the filing to be effective? And most of the time, our clients are making it effective when it's filed with the Department of State, but sometimes we'll have clients who already have been operating a business either informally or without registering it with the state. And so at that point, we're coming in after kind of cleaning it up. And so then it might not be that we want it effective upon filing of the Department of State. Or if we're getting ready to create it and we know we want it to be effective, say October 1st, you can always put that as well. So you're going to file that certificate of organization. This is an article of incorporation. So this would be for a for-profit corporation that you would file. And same thing. So you're either filing a certificate of organization or you're filing an articles of incorporation, or you may be doing a certificate of partnership. It all depends on what entity you're choosing, but the Department of State will make sure that you pick the right form. And there's always a corresponding docketing statement that goes along with it. And so you're just completing the form based on what they're asking you. And then it does have where you can submit it online. You can still do it sending in the mail. It just takes a little bit longer. So what we did notice is the Department of State is a little bit slower right now with everything that's happening. And so we're seeing, oh goodness, it's probably a 2-month delay from when we file it to when we actually see it appearing on the Department of State website. And that's what your client needs. Your client needs for it to actually show up on the Department of State website if they're doing things like a closing for real estate purposes. The settlement company is going to require that they actually have confirmation that it's been filed with the Department of State. So Amy here at our office is sometimes every day checking the Department of State website to see if the business has actually shown up yet as registered so that the closing could actually take place. This again is an example of an article of incorporation for a C corporation in Pennsylvania. Okay, so the next thing that we want to make sure to do, and again, you saw this in some of the filings with the Department of State, you have to make sure you're choosing a tax year. So you can either pick a calendar year or you can pick a fiscal year. The calendar year is January 1 through December 31st, and a fiscal year is any 12 months that ends on the last day if it's not December. So that's how you determine whether it's a fiscal or a calendar year. So those are your two options as to how you're going to run your business on a tax year. Ah, yes. So we have some I-9 forms here. So these are things that if you have an employee, now there are other forms that we always recommend in addition to that, but this is kind of the basic thing. So whenever you're starting a business, if you're going to have employees, you want to make sure that they're filling out a form I-9 as well as a W-4. And here at our office, we actually do the form W-4 every year. We have the employee do a new one and we keep it here on record. And that's all about withholding. So, what amount are we withholding from their paychecks? The Form I-9 is talking about verifying U.S. citizenship or any immigration status that a client might have. And so again, we have them fill out the I-9 when they're first employed, and we keep that here in their personnel file. So anytime you're having employees, you want to make sure that you're doing these forms. The next couple of slides, I'm not going to give a lot of specifics about it, but I thought it was worth covering here. So it's about licenses and permits. So you want to make sure that you've obtained the correct licenses and permits that you need, and that's going to depend on where you live, what business you're running, and what the Department of State may require. So you can always contact the Department of State. They do actually have a great, if you go to their website, it can direct you where you need to go as far as, if you're doing something with sales tax, or we had one client who was doing things for a liquor license, those type of things. You can always go to the Department of State website and they'll direct you in the correct place. But we want to make sure before you're actually opening your doors, you have all of those company licenses and permits that you need. So depending on the business, you might need a general business license, you might need trade licenses. So if you're a home-based business, the other thing you have to be careful of is if you are working out of your home, check to make sure what does your local government require. So what does your municipality, your borough, wherever it is that you live, what are their requirements if you're going to be a home-based business? You want to make sure you're filing that correctly. And so you can usually reach out to your local government or your city website, and they will direct you in the correct place there. Trade licenses, for example, childcare or other professional pursuits. So here at our office, I have to be licensed as an attorney. We have one client who is talking about opening a childcare business, and so we're talking to them about all of the certifications that they need in order to be able to do that. So you just want to make sure that you're properly getting all that certification in place prior to actually opening your doors and engaging with the community. Home occupation permits, sales tax permits. This is all about home-based businesses. So again, you still may have safety permits, sign permits, construction permits. You might have a homeowner association issues. So in one community where I lived before I moved back here to this area, I was in a development and there was a homeowners association, and they did not actually allow home-based businesses if they were in certain categories. And so you want to make sure that you're not violating any covenants that you might have entered into when you purchased your house. So just something to be able to think through if you're going to actually run it out of your home. Okay, so you have searched your name, found out if it's available, you filed the EIN, you filed whatever you need with the Department of State to get your business organized, and you've looked into all of the permits and licensings that you need. So what's the next thing? So I'm going to tell you what the law requires and what our office recommends. So when you're dealing as a corporation, and again, we are going to get into choice of entity and how you decide whether you want to be a corporation or an LLC. But if you're a corporation, Pennsylvania does require you to have annual meetings. And typically you're going to have an organizational meeting and you're going to have annual meetings. Here at our office, we always recommend that any business, regardless of how you are actually filing, so even if you're an LLC and it doesn't require you to have annual meeting minutes, if there's more than one owner or you have officers in some capacity, you want to make sure that you're having those meeting minutes, because all of this, all these things that you're doing from a legal perspective are protecting you from personal liability. So the whole reason somebody may have created a business is so that any liability or any creditor concerns stay within that entity. So one of the ways legally you do that is you're establishing the fact that this is different from you as an individual, that this is an actual entity, you are running it as an entity. And one of the ways you prove that is by having business meetings. And a lot of times clients will come in and they'll be an LLC, or they might be a partnership and have multiple members, and they haven't done annual meeting minutes. And that's okay, because what we're able to do when a client comes in is we are able to go back, and we don't backdate. We never want to backdate, but what we can do is we can memorialize meetings that we know they may have had. And the best way to do that is to think about if you've met with your accountant that year, like as a business, if you've met with your accountant, if you've reviewed the tax returns and talked about it with your accountant, those would all be considered types of meetings that you're having. And so a lot of times businesses are having these annual meetings without realizing that they're complying with what they're supposed to be doing. So all it is, though, is for the meeting minutes, you want to make sure you're documenting that. So if we have a client who has come in and maybe they were established in 2017, but they haven't been doing annual meeting minutes, what our office will do is we'll say, okay, why don't you go back and memorialize instead of signing it saying, hey, we have this meeting today, this time, this is what we discussed. You might do something where you're saying in the tax season of 2021 or 2020, you might even be able to say a specific date if you know you met with your accountant or you had something on your calendar where you had a call or an appointment with your accountant. You may be actually able to put the specific date, but otherwise you can go back and say, during the tax season in April of 2020, I met with my accountant and we held our annual meeting. This is what we discussed. And a lot of times it's just going over things like general business expenses, deductions, anything that you're talking through with your accountant and you want to just make sure you're documenting it for business purposes. So this is a template that we use at our office to at least get businesses started. And so what it is it's just identifying when was it held, it's identifying who was there, who called the meeting to order, who all was present. If it's a corporation, you do have to have officers. And so typically we would vote on who's going to be officers, or if it's just going to be the same people, you approve the same lineup of officers. And then you're going to see there on the document, it says discussion in parentheses in all capital. We would put something in there talking about things that you might have discussed with your accountant or with your other business partners. And then you're just going to have everybody sign it. And you're going to have, or you can have the secretary sign it too. So whoever's taking the notes for the meeting minutes. So it seems like meeting minutes are a stumbling block for businesses. They always question, how do we do it? How do we go about it? The nice thing is that Pennsylvania does allow you to be really flexible as far as what you're including in your meeting minutes. They just have a general structure they want to see. Did you have it? When did you have it? Who was there? What did you vote on? Who are the officers? Those type of things need to be included. But I always encourage people, to the extent you haven't been doing that, it's not too late. You can go back and memorialize events that you know occurred and things that you might have talked about. And then that way, what you're doing is this just creating another layer of protection that's saying, yes, this is an actual entity, and it's not just me, myself out here treating it as a business. It actually is a business. So we encourage all of our businesses to do meeting minutes, and we do keep track of them. So if it's something where you want us to facilitate that meeting, Amy has a little reminder on her calendar that she'll reach out to clients and say, hey, it's time to have your annual meeting. And so we go ahead and schedule that. And we can even actually hold the meeting here at our office and then do the minutes for them. Okay, let's move on, Amy. So a lot of times clients may not realize this, but they'll have governing documents that state that there has to be a notice to all of the business owners of the upcoming meeting. And if there isn't notice given, the owners can waive it. And so this is an example of a waiver that we use. So a lot of times bylaws may say, it requires 14 days notice to all of the owners, and nobody remembered to actually send the notice out. And so you can just have your owners or shareholders sign off on the waiver of notice at the actual annual meeting. But you want to make sure, is it required according to your bylaws? Okay, so that brings us to our rules and regulations of the business. So let's advance that, Amy. Let's see what we have here. So this is fun. I know everybody's going to love this slide. So this is our choice of entity slide. There's a lot of information packed on this slide, and what I wanted to do is just cover the basics with you. So when we're talking about entity, there are two things that we're looking at. So we're looking at, again, the whole reason most people do this is for creditor protection. So it's creditor protection versus the tax benefits. A lot of times we'll have a discussion with the accountant, or if the client doesn't have an accountant, we'll recommend an accountant so that we can make sure that we're getting that tax side addressed in this, because we know, some basics, but we want to make sure that any specific tax related questions are being answered as it relates to a choice of entity. And a lot of things I have discovered just from my own personal experience about choice of entities, which I'll share. And a lot of it I've learned from talking with clients and figuring out what works best. So the easiest entity is, of course, the sole proprietor. So that's just where there's one person, they're not filing a separate return at all for the business. It might be included on their Schedule C of their 1040, and it could be a single person, or it could be that it is husband and wife. And if you're husband and wife, you can still disclose it on a Schedule C. So a sole proprietorship doesn't necessarily have to file anything with a Department of State. If anything, you might file a fictitious name in order to hold the name there so nobody else can use it, because again, it does require consent if somebody has too close of a name to what you've already registered. So there's some benefit to still registering even if you're a sole proprietor. That being said, let's hit some of these other things. So we have a corporation. So the corporation is what most people think of when they think of a business entity. And the reason they think of that is because you're going to get the most creditor protection from a corporation. And that's just really how a corporation is set up, is they're going to be shareholders. So most businesses, there are shareholders. The shareholders vote and elect officers, and that's how that works. So it's like the shareholders pick the officers, and then the officers kind of run the day-to-day business. We see that with bigger entities. Um, the downside of a corporation is, of course, the double taxation that you're going to have. So the shareholders will pay tax as well as the corporation itself will. So in our area here in Waynesboro and a lot of other areas across Pennsylvania, a lot of people opt not to do a corporation because of that double tax. So what are some of your other options? So if you want to get some additional creditor protection, but maybe you don't want to go through the formalities or the double taxation of a corporation, you can do an S corporation. So an S corporation is established like a corporation. So that means that under the Department of State, as well as when you're filing it with the IRS, you're actually a corporation. It's just that you then make an additional tax election by filing a form, and it's Form 2553. When you file that with the IRS, that then elects a tax election. So the actual entity is still a corporation, but you're just electing to be taxed as what we call pass-through entity. Pass-through entity is like an LLC or a partnership. It just means that the tax isn't paid at the corporation level. Instead, it all flows through to those shareholders, and they would then disclose the tax on their return. And so the difference you're going to see is, again, making that tax election. But as far as how it's registered with the state for creditor concerns, it is still going to the Department of State website and filing articles of incorporation. So sometimes that confuses people because they get on the website and they're looking for filing forms for an S corporation, and they're not going to be there. You're going to file it as a corporation, and then you're just going to file the appropriate forms with the IRS to elect to be taxed as a tax-through entity. There are some limitations on the shareholders of an S corporation. So all shareholders must be U.S. citizens. You're going to file, like we said, that Form 2553. We had one client who came to us and had somebody informally prepare their tax returns. And so they filed as a corporation, and the preparer told them that it was an S corporation, but no Form 2553 was actually filed. And so they are not actually an S corporation because that was not properly filed. So you want to make sure that you're filing that. An S corporation has to have less than 100 shareholders. They all have to fall under a certain classification of an individual, certain types of trusts, or an exempt organization. You can typically only have one class of stock, and the shareholders can't be non-resident aliens. So there are some restrictions to get that tax benefit. And so we wanted to make sure we outlined those. If you're an LLC or a limited liability company, that's a little bit different. So you still have liability protection for certain things. However, what it's doing is it's saying that everything is taxed at the owner or the member's level. So again, it's passing through. And that's going to be a Form 1065 that you're going to file with the IRS. That's the actual form when you have an LLC that you file. And then any gain or loss is going to be what we call K1'd out. So a K1 schedule is going to show that going out to the owners or the members. So that's an LLC. What's interesting is that when I first started practicing law back in 2008, I was practicing up in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and LLCs weren't always the best structure because at that time we were dealing with a lot of oil and gas royalties that were being paid to an LLC, and Pennsylvania had a capital stock tax at the time. But it's a tax that's imposed on corporations and LLCs. And so the issue we had was that people were setting up an LLC thinking there wasn't a lot of filing stuff like you had to do with a corporation, but Pennsylvania still had a capital stock tax. They were getting hit with a tax they didn't know that they were going to have. So we had a lot of people who normally may have done an LLC, we had them switch to other entities at that time. Now, the capital stock tax was eliminated beginning in January of 2016. However, I learned when I created my entity, I learned that LLCs do have to file a certificate of annual registration with the Department of State if they're a restricted professional limited liability company. So that's a doctor, that's a dentist, that's an attorney, that would be an accountant, or that would be a veterinarian. So any professional services, they need to make sure that they are doing the annual registration. So that's due by April 15th every year. And so you want to make sure that you're doing that. And then the last entity is a partnership. And so the default in Pennsylvania, when you have more than one owner or business partner, the default is a general partnership in Pennsylvania. You have to elect or file a certificate of limited partnership if you want to get that creditor protection. And so a general partnership means that there's no creditor protection for those partners that are part of the business. If something would happen and the entity would get sued, it applies to each general partner as well. A limited partner is somebody who gets some of that protection. So they aren't generally liable for the entity. Now, the problem with the limited partnership is that you still have to have at least one general partner. So you have to have somebody who's at least generally liable for the entity itself. And so a lot of times when people opt to use a limited partnership, you actually see an LLC as the general partner of the limited partnership. So you can stack entities within each other if that works for creditor purposes. So this is a little summary of the choice of entity and how we look at it. And again, our main focus is probably the creditor protection because we feel like that's what clients are coming to us for. And then what we do is we work in conjunction with the accountant to make sure that it's offering the best tax benefits. And I do know that when I started my business, I did call my accountant and they provided some guidance as to what they thought would be the best for me based on what they knew I was going to be doing. So I always encourage people to reach out. So let's talk about the governing documents because we have the choices of entities, and then based on the entity you choose, the governing document is named something different. What's important to know about this, though, is that the governing documents are just really the set of rules that you use for the business. Like, how will it be run? How is it going to be managed day to day? How do profits get shared? How do losses get shared? That's all in the governing documents. So if you're doing a corporation, whether it be a for-profit or a nonprofit entity or an S corporation, it's going to be bylaws that you have as the governing document. So you file articles of incorporation with the state of Pennsylvania for corporation, and then what you do is you have your attorney draft bylaws that outline how is the business going to be run. And so it says things like, is it majority rules if you're voting on something? Is it a higher percentage? What requires, maybe 85% of the ownership to agree to that? Talks about whether or not you can transfer your ownership interest. And if you can, who are you able to transfer it to? Does it require the other owners to sign off on that? So you're going to see that in the bylaws. For an S corporation, again, you're going to see bylaws and you're going to see articles of incorporation. It's just that you're electing something for tax purposes, and that's filing that form 2553 for the tax treatment. And I keep bringing that up because we just have so many clients who call and they'll say, I can't find the forms on the Department of State website for S corporations. And that's because they are articles of incorporation. Once you file them, then you're just electing something for the tax treatment. So an LLC, that's the limited liability company. So you're actually going to file a certificate of organization to create that entity. And then you're going to have an operating agreement as the governing document for an LLC. And typically where shareholders are the owners of a corporation, members are the owners of an LLC. You can have two types of LLCs. It can be a manager managed LLC, or it can be a member managed LLC. So let's just say here at my office, I have 4 gals in here in the office with me. Let's just say I wanted to create an entity with them. So it would be, the 5 of us. And what you could do is you could say, we're going to have it be where everybody gets a vote and whatever the majority is, that's how decisions are made. Or you can say, we're going to have members, but there's going to be a manager. And this is the one member who runs the day-to-day operations, but everybody gets to share in the profits and losses. So an LLC does allow you to be either manager managed or member managed. And that's going to be an operating agreement and a certificate of organization that you're going to need for that. And then a partnership, for a general partnership, you just technically may want to file a fictitious name if you want to hold that name so nobody else can take it. Otherwise, you're going to want to file a certificate of limited partnership so that you get some creditor protection. And then you're going to want to have a partnership agreement that outlines what the partners can do. Okay, so what items do you include in your governing document? So basic corporate information. So what's the business's formal name? What's the address? Where does it operate its business out? If it's a corporation, it's going to have who are the board of directors. So it'll have officers in there, who are the shareholders. So another way that you can do it is when you're having a corporation, you can have shareholders who vote on the board of directors, who vote on the officers. So with a corporation, you can actually have three levels of people who are voting, if you will. Sometimes we'll just see shareholders who vote on officers. So maybe the board of directors portion of that is left out. But if you're going to have a board of directors and officers, you want to make sure that's outlined in there. And then you want to make sure that you have outlined, who owns stock in the company and how does the voting occur. Are there going to be certain committees that people have? So, for example, I do serve on a nonprofit board, and we have the ability in our bylaws to be able to create subcommittees if we need them. All right, so let's talk about a power of attorney. This may seem an odd thing. So today is not designed to be an estate planning virtual seminar, but we've had this come up quite frequently in some of the business clients that we're dealing with. So it's that discussion of a power of attorney. So we always recommend that every individual have a financial power of attorney, and that governs the personal finances of the individual. However, we have business clients who have ownership in an entity. So let's just say I owned 50% of a business entity. Who has the right, if I become incapacitated, to be able to vote or handle that 50%? So sometimes this will be addressed in the governing documents, so the bylaws, the operating agreement, or the partnership agreement. But most times there's nothing in there talking about it. And so when we have a client who has a business, there are two ways you can handle it. So the first is that in all of our basic power of attorneys, we include a provision, a section in the power of attorney that talks about business transactions and how that can be handled. And so we have it in every power of attorney. So it could be that you're giving whoever you're giving your personal financial authority to, you can also give it related to your business. But more often than not, there's another business owner that you want to be able to be handling your business or, making decisions for the business. And so you may have a separate limited business power of attorney. And that's just saying, for this entity, this is the person who can handle my 50% ownership. So you can have a completely separate power of attorney. You just want to make sure that your personal one, dealing with your personal finances, references the business one so that it's not confusing. So you want to make sure that your attorney is dealing with that. The other way you can do it, the one way we did it just recently, is we use the personal financial power of attorney. Only those provisions in that personal financial power of attorney are under section P. So as you go through the document, it's farther back in our power of attorney, and the section is paragraph P. So what we might do on the first page is we may say, I'm appointing my spouse as the power of attorney or the agent for my personal, but any power under paragraph P we're giving to this person who's the business partner with you. So you want to make sure that you're bringing it up. And every time I brought this up, a client does not have it specifically addressed in the power of attorney. They haven't even thought about it. So again, even if you opt to have it be the same person and you're just going to have it be in your personal power of attorney, you want to make sure that you've at least discussed it with your business partner, because if you do a power of attorney but your partner doesn't, and your partner is the one who becomes incapacitated, then you needed that power of attorney for you to be able to do what you needed to do. So I wanted to have a slide encouraging people to either have it in your regular power of attorney, your personal power of attorney, or to execute a separate standalone business power of attorney. Buy-sell agreements. So there are two ways you can do buy-sell agreements. So you can do a buy-sell where it's included in the governing document. So you might have provisions in the bylaws or in the operating agreement, partnership agreement dealing with a buy-sell, or you can have a separate buy-sell agreement. My preference is actually to have a separate buy-sell agreement. And the reason for that is because sometimes partners may change what they want the terms of the buy-sell to be. So they may renegotiate that periodically, but they don't want to have to talk or discuss the same basic terms that they've already gotten all of the owners to agree to. So I like them to be two separate documents. That being said, in the governing document, I reference if there is a standalone buy-sell agreement. So a buy-sell agreement is just talking about if a partner or a business owner wants to sell their interest at any point, how do they go about doing that? Can they offer it to a third party outside the business, or are they first offering it to each other? And what are the terms of that? You want to outline all of that. So sometimes it's just really what order can people purchase, and you might get an appraisal. Or sometimes it's actually stipulating what those terms would be in the buy-sell agreement. I always feel the more specific you can be, the more comprehensive you can be, the better it is for the business partners, because then you're not running into a situation where something pops up and you didn't think that that would happen and you haven't addressed it. So I always encourage people to have a buy-sell. A lot of times I'll review a client who already has an existing business. I'll review their buy-sell agreement or their governing document to see if they have buy-sell provisions in there. And I'm always surprised at how often it's not included in the documents. You want to make sure that you do have that. So what is the purpose of a buy-sell? So again, we talked about this. If Amy and I are in business together and let's say she decides she wants to sell out, under what terms can she do that? Does she have to offer it to me first? All of that good stuff. The other things that a buy-sell might include is what happens at death. And so you want to make sure that if that's going to be a triggering buying or selling situation, that you're putting that into the document. So here are the types of buy sells. You can have a cross purchase, you can have an entity purchase, or you can have a hybrid. So cross purchase just means that if Amy wants out of the business, I can purchase her and vice versa. An entity purchase means that if somebody wants out, the actual entity itself, the business itself, would buy back their shares. And a hybrid would be maybe you give them the option to have a cross purchase. If the other owners opt not to buy it, then maybe the entity buys it. So you want to make sure that you're figuring out what is the best way. And I think the easiest way to figure out what type of buy sell is to actually back into that decision by figuring out the financing portion of it. So how is this going to be paid? Is it going to be a lump sum? Is it going to be a note that the buying owner is going to be purchasing over a period of years? And so that can really help determine what's the best type of purchase agreement that you need. And a cross purchase really works best if there's only two owners. You can do it if there's three, but any more than three, and it can be really complicated about, purchasing it. So I see cross purchase used most often when there are three or less owners. And like we talked about, it can be a separate agreement or it can be in the governing document itself. So what is a cross purchase? Owner one purchases owner two interest in the business when owner dies, or when owner goes into a nursing home, or if owner ever decides they just want to be out of the business. So you have to outline what is the triggering event, and you have to outline whether it's mandatory or whether they just have the option. And if it's mandatory, what party is forced to do it, or if it's optional, what party has the option to trigger it. So you want to make sure you're covering that in a cross purchase. An entity purchase is just whether business purchased it from the deceased owner's interest. So an example would be big company buys the owner one and owner two's share of the business at each of their deaths. So, and if we go to the next slide, that's the hybrid. So usually you have one option, and it's usually cross purchase first, and then if not, then the business can purchase. So here are some advantages and disadvantages of it. Now we're running a little bit short on time. So what I can do is if anybody wants to know these specifics, we can actually email out the slideshow so that you have it. But there are some very interesting tax consequences, I'll say that, and very nuanced tax implications of using a cross purchase. So you want to make sure that you're covering the advantages and the disadvantages. Amy, let's go ahead and advance through these for now. And this would be if you had a stock redemption or an entity purchase. Okay, we can always go back if we have some time and somebody wants to go over this. But the second part of the presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about if you already have an entity and you need to go back and fix things up. It's not too late to make sure and to get your documents in order if you have an entity. So a lot of times I'll have a client who has a long-standing business. They may have inherited it from family members, previous generations. So they will bring in their stack of stuff that they have for the business. And the first thing I do is look over it and I give a summary of what is in your current documents. You would be surprised how often I say, this is what your document says. And a client will say, well, that's not what I wanted to happen, or that's not what I want to have happen at my death. So the first thing is to have somebody look at your documents and do a summary. And we actually do put it in writing. We'll put it in writing and say, this is what, in layman's terms, your document does. You know, is there a buy sell? What are the provisions of that? What happens at your death? Can you transfer the interest? All of those things we'll summarize for you. Then what we have to do is we have to figure out what needs to be done. So here are some common mistakes. And this slide alone, we could spend quite a long time on. So first thing that we've noticed is sometimes the registered office on the Department of State website is incorrect. So when we're holding annual meetings for clients, first thing we do, even though we checked it the year before, is we get on the Department of State website while the client is here and we check to see, is this the correct registered office? Goodness, it's probably 9 times out of 10, if we haven't been checking it and they come in with an entity, they haven't looked and we have to change the registered office because it's incorrect. And again, it's all about making sure that you have all of the documentation needed to ensure you get the creditor protection that you want if something happens with your business. So having the registered office correct on the Department of State is so important. So always get on and make sure that's correct. Second thing that we see as a common mistake is the officers of the business on the Department of State website are not updated. I helped a local business, it's probably been about a year or so ago, and we looked on there and they're like, I don't even know who that person is. And so I think what had happened in that case is somebody's name was spelled incorrectly, but you couldn't even, it wasn't a name anybody knew. We don't know where it came from. So we have to update those. Now, interestingly, the officers appear on the Department of State website. So if you go to the Department of State website on Pennsylvania's site, you'll see the officers. But when you change them, you have to actually change them through the Department of Revenue. So if a client says, no, that's not the correct officers, we have to go to the Department of Revenue site and print off a change of officer form and submit it to the Department of Revenue. Then what happens is the Department of Revenue communicates that to the Department of State website. So not only does it have to go through the Department of Revenue's system, but then they have to notify the Department of State. So again, that's where Amy's getting on and obnoxiously checking the entry on the Department of State website to make sure that those officers have been updated. So that's important to make sure you do. The other thing that we have is that somebody didn't account for the fact that if there's real estate that's going to be transferred into the entity, depending on what type of business it is, there may be a 2% transfer tax that applies. And so a lot of times attorneys know that, who are helping, like, for example, farming families set up their entity. And so they just took a shortcut and instead they deeded the property. In one case, it was in 3 brothers' names, and 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. They wanted it to be in the business, but it wasn't actually titled in the name of the business because nobody wanted to trigger the transfer tax. And at that time, there wasn't the exemption for the agricultural use like there is now. So you want to make sure that if you're using an entity and it's going to own real estate, is there a transfer tax that applies? Because maybe you actually want to purchase that real estate in the entity itself to start off with, so that you don't have to incur a 2% to transfer the property into the entity. And the second thing is you want to make sure that your attorney is looking through and making sure that all of the exemptions that could apply are applying. So we had a client located in Altoona who it was 3 brothers, and they had an entity that owned their personal residences. So 3 of them, all 3 properties were owned in this LLC. The issue with that is if they would sell the property in this LLC, they don't qualify for the 121 exclusion for selling your primary residence and being able to shelter the gain. So we needed to get that property out of the LLC and each into their individual names. And so in that case, what we did is that Pennsylvania does have an exemption against realty transfer tax if you convey it out in the ownership interest that the owners of the LLC. So again, they owned it 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That's how they owned the LLC. That's how the property was deeded in the LLC. So what we did is we did a new deed, taking it from the LLC and putting it 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in each brother's name. And as long as somebody owned their 1/3 for longer than 2 years, and conveyed it out in the equal proportion to the ownership of the entity, there was no transfer tax. So then what the brothers did is once they got everything out in 1/3, then the brothers could gift it between each other. And so we were able to do that and avoid the 2% tax. But you have to make sure that your attorney or your legal professional is looking through all those options. Next thing is the incorrect name and a mismatch with the EIN filing. So Amy and I had to deal with this recently where the client went to actually open up the bank account and the person who had filed the original tax filings with the IRS to get the EIN had done the business, but there was one word missing when they then filed it with the Department of State. And so the bank would not open the account because the EIN filing did not match the Department of State filing. So we had to correct that for them so that they could actually be able to open the bank account. So just making sure you have the correct names there and making sure you're electing the correct tax filings for it. We often see clients who don't have annual meetings. So we talked about how you can correct that and memorialize events that have happened in the past. So you want to make sure you're doing that. We always have, and it's nothing formal. You don't have to order any special book, but a lot of times we'll put together a corporate book for our clients that includes the filings with the Department of State, that includes their governing documents, that includes their EIN numbers, that includes their annual meeting minutes, as well as any transfers that they've made of the entities. So having even an informal corporate book can be really helpful. Next thing is not completing the annual filings by the Department of State or the IRS as needed. So again, you're going to have to file the tax returns by the appropriate deadlines. If you are a professional LLC, a professional services LLC, you have to make sure you're doing that annual registration by the April 15th deadline. We always put ticklers on our calendar to make sure that we're ensuring those filings occur. So you might want to employ that as a way to keep track of it. And then we see a lot of times where the clients don't have a governing document, or they might have a governing document that doesn't allow certain things. So we do a lot of nursing home planning and asset protection planning. And because of that, we may want to transfer the business interest into a trust to protect it, because there's actually not long-term care protection for certain business entities. So if somebody would go into a nursing home, that business entity is available for their care. So we may want to throw it into a trust or transfer it somewhere. So you want to make sure that the governing document, if you have one, addresses long-term care costs. You also want to make sure that it allows certain transfers if you want to. So for example, can they transfer it to a trust where they're still going to be the trustee and the beneficiary? So a revocable living trust, or all transfers require, all members to sign off on it. You want to make sure that your financial power of attorney, talking about making sure that that matches what's in the document. So, the financial power of attorney isn't necessarily going to allow your co-owner the ability to operate your business. You want to make sure that that's addressed in the governing document and in your power of attorney. And then lastly, if we have somebody who has a governing document and there are death provisions, meaning when I die, this is what happens, 9 times out of 10, it's not what they actually want to have happen. So we spend a lot of time revamping and revising those death provisions to make sure that the ownership interest is going where you want it to go. So you want to make sure you're covering that. And we are going to post this after we wrap everything up. We'll put it on our YouTube channel as well as our social media platforms. So feel free to share it. We'll send a link to all of our clients and referral sources who have asked us to do that. We send out a link to let them know, hey, here's where you can see it on YouTube. Our next monthly virtual seminar is October 20th. And we're doing it on the tricks of Medicaid. So we're trying to touch all of the topics during our virtual seminar. So we're going to be going back to the Medicaid rules and going over those. You can register by emailing Amy, and her email address is on there, or you can always call. And you can also complete the registration form on our website. And we do also have links to all of our videos and all of that on our website as well. Amy will be emailing you a link after the survey, so to the extent you want to provide us feedback, we always appreciate that. Okay, so that being said, I want to thank everybody for being on this call. We always appreciate it. For those of you who are watching it on our YouTube channel or on our social media platforms, we always encourage you, if you have questions or concerns, we're here, we want to help. So always reach out to us. And thank you guys so much for taking the time over your lunchtime hour to be here. I'm going to stop the recording now. So thanks everybody for being here. I'm Samantha at the law offices of Samantha Wolfe, and we look forward to hearing from you.